The book of James is the short little book about 5 chapters long, tucked right in the back of the Old Testament behind Hebrews, and it is packed full of amazing theology and instruction for us today. And on this channel, we are going to start a little Bible study going through it. I say little, I don't know how long it actually is going to take, because the more I study this, the more it just unfolds and it keeps giving. It's like, oh my gosh, I just keep digging and digging and digging, and it keeps having deeper and deeper things. So I'm stoked to start this series. My idea is to do one James video a week, one reaction video a week. We'll see what we can do with that. I know my life can get pretty busy, so I will do my best to be on top of it with 2 videos minimum a week. If you are new here, I don't know when you're watching this. The channel used to be called Everyday Gospel. In discussion with a couple of my friends and my wife, I decided to change it to Theological Mutt, because that's much more direct about who I am. My name is Ethan, and I am what I call a theological mutt. I have a couple of different views that, I'm not any specific denomination, and I'm not sure where I fit in the denominational landscape. I've done ministry for 8 years, doing teachings all across the world, primarily focused on training people to go into missions. And so my passion, my excitement for scripture is also fueled by this desire to get it out to the world to help people grow in their faith. I love evangelism, sharing the gospel, and teaching people how to do that. And so this little online YouTube ministry is just another way that I can do that. Another way I can do that. Excuse me, I need some water. But without any further ado, we are going to get into the book of James. All right, don't you like that little slide I did? Turns out making slideshows, when you're doing them in a very minimal sense, very easy, very time efficient. And I like that format for teaching. So we're going to talk about the book of James, and here are the things we are going to get into, right? We're going to talk about who is James? Is he the brother of Jesus or not? Between Protestants, Catholics, and I think some Orthodox as well, there's some disagreement there. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Not the most comprehensive deep dive, so don't expect an hour-long lecture on the identity of James. We're going to look at the first readers and talk about why that's important for Bible study. We'll get there in a second. The date written, it's pretty self-explanatory, so that'll be a shorter part of the video. And then the genre and the theme, I have epistle there. There's a lot more that goes with the themes that are fun that we'll get into. But you might be asking, as far as Bible study, like, why does this matter? Why do I need to know who James is, the first readers, the date, the themes? Like, what does that matter for my study? Can't I just read the Bible and apply it? And obviously, we want to apply the Bible. However, there's a couple steps before we get to application that inform our application. And so we can't just go from reading straight to application without knowing some of these things. The first readers and what they are going through informs the writing of James, right? James is writing to a specific audience. That's how we know it's an epistle. And they are going through some seriously hard things we'll get into. And therefore, when you read his instructions to count it all joy when you face trials of many kind, you're like, oh, this is who he's talking to. This is what they're going through. And that informs how we go through our struggles, because surprisingly, we'll get into this later in this video, surprisingly, the first century Jewish Christians were going through some things that Americans feel like they're going through now. It's like a cool little similarity that will be able to help us in our application. So let's get into who is James. I'm a Protestant, and so I've always believed that James is the brother of Jesus. I had no idea that there was a discussion between Protestants and Catholics until, honestly, a few months ago, probably. And I was surprised, because I was like, guys, I thought that was pretty clear, but I guess not. So I think James is the brother of Jesus. The only reason I think that can be controversial is because, at least the Catholics, I don't try to pick on Catholics, they're just the only other tradition I know the most about. Maybe Anglicans, I'm not sure about Anglicans, and maybe Orthodox. They believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. And so the idea is that Mary was always a virgin until the day she died, and she never wasn't a virgin. So therefore, Jesus can't have any brothers that Mary birthed, because that would impose on this idea that she was a perpetual virgin. And I think that's the only reason that people feel the need to defend that James isn't Jesus's brother. But through scripture, it makes it pretty clear in my mind that he's Jesus's brother, right? You have Mark 6:3. I can't show you guys on it, but Mark 6:3 talks about Jesus is doing miracles, and they say, isn't this the carpenter's son? And isn't his mother and his brother James with us? Let me pull up my Bible. Where's my phone? Yeah, so Mark 6:3 says, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. So there we got James is listed as a brother, but then you also flip to later in Mark chapter 15, verse 40, and it says, there were also some women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the Less, and Joseph and Salome. So with those two verses, you have the people in his community saying, oh yeah, mother of Jesus is Mary, and his brother is James. And then at the crucifixion, you have Mary, the mother of James. And, you know, like I said, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds here, but the people who want to defend the perpetual virginity of Mary will say maybe this word brother means cousin. I don't know how strong that argument is, but that's why I think James is the brother of Jesus. Now, he was more than that as well. He was a pillar of the early church. Okay, so Paul calls him a pillar in Galatians 2:9, which means he was one of the leaders of the church in Acts. Now, what is important to know is that James, the brother of Jesus, didn't follow Jesus while Jesus was alive. It was only after his resurrection that he became a Christian and a believer, and then, therefore, became a pillar in the church. And what's really important to know is that you don't want to confuse this James with the James in the New Testament who was following Jesus, right? Jesus had two disciples named James. There was one James who was at the Transfiguration, and a James, the son of Alphaeus, I think. Now, James who was at the Transfiguration was martyred in Acts, and then later in Acts, you see a James pop up speaking in Acts 15. You're like, I thought this guy died. Two separate Jameses, one the Transfiguration James, one the brother of Jesus, became a Christian after the resurrection, became a pillar of the church. And then what happened to James, right? Well, tradition tells us that he was thrown from the temple corner and stoned and clubbed to death. So he was a martyr as well, different way than James who's at the Transfiguration. Really authoritative in the church, clearly authoritative enough to write a letter to Christians and give instructions for doctrine. Paul recognizes him as a pillar of the church. That's a pretty big deal. So there is a little intro into James. Now, the first readers, if you look at James 1:1, it talks about the 12 tribes in the dispersion. It talks about, hey, this is James writing to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Now, what does that even mean? With that terminology, you kind of have to know your Bible a little bit. The 12 tribes in the dispersions is a term that represents Jews who are dispersed throughout the world. You know, in the Old Testament, they went into exile. Not all came back. The northern tribe, which was 10 of the tribes, was just completely basically obliterated, and they never became a nation again. And so they're dispersed, right? They're remnants. The people are dispersed in the world. And so there's some conversation around who is the dispersion. Is it just Jewish Christians that James is writing to? That's plausible. Or is he writing to all Christians everywhere, identifying them as the dispersion or the 12 tribes of Israel in the dispersion? That's the view I hold, because Paul talks about how that there's a spiritual Israel, and that Christians have been grafted into spiritual Israel. And so we are, as Christians, Gentiles in the spiritual Israel, so 12 tribes of Israel, can apply to us. Now, it's not surprising that he would use this language, because some people might say, well, if he's not writing to just Jews, why would he even reference the 12 tribes and the dispersion? Like, you got to recognize this is a Jewish guy, and Christianity started from Judaism. So it's no surprise that he's using Jewish language if most of the church would have been Jews, or at least 50% of the church potentially could be Jews. So yeah, in my opinion, it's to all Christians throughout the world. We're in spiritual Israel, so we can be counted as the 12. And specifically, so now getting a little bit more specific rather than just like general Christians, what was going on with the audience that he was writing to, specifically the Jewish audience that was following Jesus, but also could apply to the Gentiles because Christians were persecuted, is that a lot of the people he was writing to, a lot of Christians in this time apparently were poor and didn't have a lot of financial independence or confidence maybe. And so you have like low income earning Jews that are being oppressed by the rich, and low income earning Christians being oppressed by the rich. And as far as the Jewish side, it got so bad that eventually it led to, I think, what's called the Jewish Wars. I believe Josephus writes about that. And it was kind of this rebellion from the Jewish community towards the Romans because they were being oppressed. Their land was being taken. They didn't have enough money. There were food shortages, so they couldn't eat. And so everyone's just like angry and hostile because like they don't have food, they don't have money, they don't have solid work, they're struggling, and the government's not really helping them, so they get angry. That is why I said it's kind of similar to how people feel in America. Yes, in America, we have tons of government programs to help a lot of people, and so we're not nearly as bad off as they were if they had food shortages. But we have people who are angry at the rich who are taking all the money while there's so many people struggling, where there's like 30% of people working in factories are on welfare. Like, that shouldn't be a thing. I believe that number's accurate. And you know, you have people who are struggling financially being angry at people who are just, you know, billionaires and not really concerned and saying they're concerned, but really not maybe doing much. And so you can see the kind of the similarities that I mentioned earlier where it's kind of surprising. And so why this is important, why it's important to know about the first readers and the struggles they're going through, right? They're low income earning people being oppressed by the rich. Maybe you watching this feel like that, you know, there's tons of injustice financially in America. I'm not even going to try to say there's not, you know, it's a mess. And so you're angry and you want justice. That's a good thing. We want justice as Christians. And so do these people. But then James kind of writes and says, okay, here's how to act when you feel this way. There are right Christian ways to go about this. And we want to make sure we're doing that. And that's what James is going to help us figure out is, one, for the early Christians, hey, you're angry and you're poor and you're not having all this and you're just overwhelmed by the stresses of life and you're getting angry. Okay, there's a right way to do that. And hint, hint, it's not like what your flesh wants. It's not overthrowing the powers that be and asserting dominance and, you know, destroying the man and fight the man and eat the rich, as people in our culture say. That's not it. And so James has some stuff to say to us regarding that, which is why I'm getting excited to get into this. Okay, and the date written is just AD 62 before that. Not AD 62, because that's the year he died, but before the year 62. Which, if you think about it, is pretty impressive because Christ, ascended around the 30s. So within 30 years, you got some writings to Christians who are spread across the empire. That's pretty solid, right? Pretty early date. Not much to go through over there. And to wrap this video up, give you some basic genre and theme elements. This is an epistle, although some people say it could be more like an essay. Some ways we know it's an epistle, which if you're new to the Bible, an epistle is just a letter, is because it has an introduction identifying the author, James, to a specific audience, the 12 tribes in the dispersion, and then it goes into like teachings on Christian living. And so one of the ways it's not like a formal epistle is that it doesn't have a formal outro like you see in Paul's writings, and Paul's writing have a little bit more structure. So there's that. And kind of the flow of James is that it has all these things called parenesis. I think I'm saying that right, parenesis, which are basically, it's defined as advice or exhortation and counsel of religious or moral nature. So James is just chock full of moral religious teaching, and because of that, it's been called the Proverbs of the New Testament. It's just like command, command, command. It's like boom, 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 wisdom, 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 all throughout. Like, it's, if you really read that and the Proverbs, you're like, wow, yeah, I can see the similarities. And what I really like about it is that it is incredibly direct and practical. Direct and practical. This is not like confusing theology like some of Paul's writings. This is just, here's how to live practically as a Christian in these capacities. Boom, 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 boom. Very great. That's kind of why I want to get into it, because it just speaks so clearly to us that we have to confront it. And it's amazing. So some themes and conclusion of this video could be controlling speech, wisdom from God versus cultural wisdom, dealing with persecution or oppression from the rich. What does the wisdom of God say, how to answer that? The word perfection or variation of the word perfect is used 4 times in the 5 chapters, which should clue us into that there's something about the idea of perfection that James wants us to get if he's bringing it up that many times, almost once a chapter. And then there's a lot of parallels to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is really cool. So that is what I'm like really excited to get into, is like some of those parallels, figuring out what that word, that idea of perfection and the theme of perfection is, and just the teachings of that to the original audience and how they can apply to us today in 2025. I'm stoked. I'm excited. Every time I sit down to do a little Bible study into it, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's so amazing. I don't even know how to organize my thoughts into making a video. But you know what, guys? That is what we're going to get into in the next following weeks. Once a week, hopefully get a video out, at least with the Bible, once a week, doing some cultural commentary stuff or reaction. And if you want other topics, anything that you're curious about, go ahead and put in the comments. I can make sure to try and make a video about it if I can. And yeah, if you like this content, if you like the Bible, if you like Christian worldview thinking stuff, make sure to subscribe. Appreciate the follow, and like this video. Send it to someone who could benefit from it. And I'll see you in the next video. Peace.